Hey, this is Vince. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to look into what on the surface feels like a very simple concept, but is actually very complicated and can be very frustrating, especially for people who are kind of stuck in this modernist worldview. And I would say that's probably the majority of people in the Western culture. Anyway, and so this topic is the death of the author. On my channel, I like to do a number of things, but I'd say probably the biggest things that I do is to, one, share ideas on books or ideas about the Bible and religion. And so I call those things that you should know about, or ideas you should know about, or books you should know about. And the second is, I'm a big Stephen King fan, and I like to share things about his books, especially looking for the meaning in those books. I have a series I call The Gospel According to Stephen King. And so this is a pretty good topic that goes along with both of those. So what is death of the author? All right, this is a concept in literary theory, and it's going to have a lot to do with finding the meaning of a text. Like, how do we know what a text is saying? How do we know what it means? And that could sound very trivial on the surface, like kind of unimportant. But it's actually a lot more important than it sounds. While it might be fun to have discussions on the exact meaning of an REM song, or what does the ending of that of Stephen King's Dark Tower series really mean, it becomes a lot more important when it comes to things like sacred literature. When you base your whole life on it, or people think that the creator of the universe is talking to them through this text. So how do you know what it's saying? So I'm going to use the Bible a lot as an example, but like I said, this topic is really not religious in nature. It's more about literary theory. And the second thing I think you're going to find is that it helps us, not only is it this concept of literary theory, but it's going to really help us as we try to understand one another, just in our day-to-day lives and in our thoughts. All right. So to kind of lay it out for you, in this video, I'm going to kind of talk about it in a historical sense, how we found meaning from a text. First, I'll talk about authorial intent, or what's called intentionalism, and that developed around the 18th century as a product of the Enlightenment. Then we'll move on to structuralism, which came about concurrently with modernism, and then to post-structuralism, which is under the umbrella of postmodernism. And that's where we're going to encounter the death of the author. And don't worry, all of those terms, if you don't know what they mean, I'll give you definitions and hopefully very, very simple definitions as we go through them. Okay, number one, authorial intent, or what's called intentionalism. So the most common answer that you're going to hear when asking, like, what does this text mean is, well, what did the author want it to mean? Like, what was the intent here? If Stephen King watched one of my videos and commented and said, I am Stephen King, and this is not at all what that book is about. Like, you got it wrong. Well, does he get to do that? Just because he's the author, right? He doesn't know. Even though we think of this as very intuitive, like, of course he knows he's the author. He created this work. It's really not, it's not very intuitive. The idea of the author and the writer as this unique creator whose life and thoughts give meaning to a text. This really came about with the Enlightenment, especially here in the West, with our focus on the importance of the individual, like holding the individual up and the individual achievements up. Now, it's certainly true that even before this time, people did care who wrote certain works, especially when it came to sacred texts. For instance, one of the major criterion for putting a book in the New Testament was that it, or at least be thought that it was written by someone who knew Jesus in person, or like in the case of Paul, had a vision. And in fact, some books like Hebrews had a hard time getting in because the early church didn't think that there was that connection there. But once they were able to link Hebrews with Paul and say, oh, well, maybe Paul wrote it, that's when it got in. So that is true. People did care about authors, but people cared about authorship in order to give that book authority. there wasn't a great push to study the life of Paul in order to understand the meaning of the text, because Paul was thought to be the one who gave meaning to the text. So Paul was not seen as the big creative force behind this small insight that we have into his life. He was just the authority that happened to write that book. With authorial intent, it's like we're just the more we study the author, the more we'll actually know about the book, because the author is that big creative content creator. Okay, but again, going back to it, when you just say, like, should Stephen King be able to interpret his own books, it sounds like a dumb question. But if you take it apart, it really kind of collapses in on itself, this whole authorial intent. And so I'm going to share some of the problems with you, and some of them can be kind of small, like what if Stephen King just doesn't like me? Like, he's like, man, that video hit the nail on the head. This guy is like he's just seeing my thoughts. But then he found another video of mine and he didn't like it. And so now he's making this comment that I'm all wrong. And maybe he just really detests me. And so he goes on even talk shows and talks about how wrong I am. I mean, you really can't trust that. He's lying. All right. And it's funny to me how the authorial intent people can't see how easy that argument is. Some authors like Quentin Tarantino have been very outspoken that the people who watch his movies should be able to interpret them for himself. And so he's very careful not to tell you what he meant for something or what something's supposed to be about. And so there's no reason to assume that when an author does tell you what their work is about, that they're going to tell you the truth. They might be very protective of the meaning of that work. They could tell you things to get you off. Right? I need to probably delete that. They probably tell you things to send you in the wrong direction. I have a friend who's really stuck on this idea of authorial intent, and he always thinks like the checkmate that he has is he says that Ernest Hemingway, he was getting having all these questions asked him, and he was getting very frustrated about how people analyzed The Old Man and the Sea. And so he once said, symbolism is shit. The old man is just an old man, and the fish is just a fish. Well, my retort to that is, and you believe him? Like, it's possible that he's just getting upset that all these people are trying to tell him what his work meant. And hey, maybe even somebody's theory was better than what he meant in the first place, and he just got mad. And so he comes back and says, it doesn't mean anything, right? Or maybe he's embarrassed about his own ideas, and so he just doesn't want to verbalize them out loud. He lets this book speak for himself. Whatever. All right. So the argument about Hemingway really ends up turning into an argument about Hemingway's character. Like, well, is he the type of person that would lie? Right? And then that gets ridiculous because now you have to go and study you have to do a psychological analysis of the author in order to find out what kind of person they are, in order to find out what the text means. So you see what I'm saying? It's just really, this authorial intent thing is really complex. What if we discover that an author wrote the book, but they didn't want to take credit for it, and so they asked a friend of theirs to take credit for it and publish it for them? And so now we're actually asking the wrong person what the book means. Right? And then we find out all of a sudden that hey, this person didn't write it, this person really did. Well, now do we have to change all of that, the thoughts and the meaning that we ascribe to this text because now we've changed the author? Another thing we have to assume, if we assume that the author controls that content or controls the meaning of the story, is that their morals are the correct morals. And when we read a text, we have to see it through their eyes. I thought this was interesting that just recently I read something about The Boys. So The Boys is a Netflix show about superheroes. Well, the main character or the main superhero, or at least the most powerful one, is Homelander. Homelander is a Superman type of character. He's vindictive, he's power hungry, he's hateful, he's violent, and understandable. He had a really tough childhood, okay? But the creators meant for him to be this super villain. However, there are certain people in the society that the strong, powerful man who is hateful and violent and always bullies people, that person is great. And so there's an awful lot of people out there who see Homelander as the hero. So which is it? Like, does the author get to come and say, no, that you're wrong on this interpretation? And of course you want to say, well, yeah, he does. But what if it's exactly the opposite? What if the author meant for Homelander to be the hero, and all the things Homelander does that's so terrible, we look at it and think how terrible it is, but the author is saying, no, you're misunderstanding, because my intent is that we should all be acting like this, or that's the hero. Okay, it's a complicated argument. I feel like I'm rambling, but what I'm trying to get at is that if you assume authorial intent, then it's hard to figure out how to answer these questions. Another common problem with authorial intent is that over time, authors, just like everyone else, start to see the world differently. And so they may interpret the text differently. And so does that mean that our interpretation has to change with their interpretation? A good example of this is another movie, Star Wars. Like, for Star Wars fans, there's this well-known argument over, did Han shoot first? And if you're a Star Wars fan, you know what I mean by that. This refers to a scene in Star Wars where Han Solo is confronted by a bounty hunter, Greedo. During this encounter, they both shoot, and Han ends up killing Greedo. And the question is, well, who shot first? Because if Han shot first, he's a cold-blooded killer. But if Greedo shot first, then Han is just shooting out of self-defense. Well, the answer to this argument is actually, which version do you watch? In the original 1977 version, Han does shoot first. But in the later 1997 version, George Lucas changed it to where Greedo shot first, and I don't know why. I don't know if he changed the way he thought, or if he just thought we were misrepresenting that. Anyway, which one is canon? Which one do you care? Which one actually tells the story? Stephen King did something similar when he rewrote the first book of his Dark Tower series. Like, once he finished it all, he rewrote the first one, and it is very different. Which one is the correct meaning? Is there a correct meaning? This might not sound like it really matters, but what about when you get to the Bible and you have redactions of things, or you have Mark that wrote a story and then Luke who seems to copy that story? Well, does that mean that Mark's story doesn't matter anymore? Okay, so that's where we are, and then we're going to go move on to structuralism. The structuralist movement of the 19th century kind of moved away from this thought of authorial intent or intentionalism, but really only kind of. Now, as I said earlier, structuralism really developed as a period inside of modernism. So you can think of the development like this. Like, in the period of the Enlightenment, that occurred in the 17th, 18th century. And this was a period of thought where people moved away from superstitions and into a more scientific way of thinking. You might even call it the early scientific period. This is when Newton first released his book on the laws of physics, and when New Testament scholars started to write books on the life of Jesus. In fact, that's what we call them, is lives of Jesus. And they were really all about this naturalist way of looking at Jesus, because, hey, everybody knows miracles doesn't exist, right, when you get to the Enlightenment. The period of modernism started in the 19th century, and you might think of this as a later science period. The thought was, there is a rhyme and reason to everything. There are definite answers out there. They're very solid, firm answers. And all we have to do as human beings is to just look long enough, do enough experiments, gather enough data, and then humans can figure out anything. So the big thing to remember is, for modernism, there are firm, unchangeable, definite answers out there. We just need to uncover them. Okay, and so in walks structuralism. Structuralism was a kind of way to understand cultures, and especially languages. And again, it's going to try to make it into some kind of math, right? So we can definitely understand them. Anthropologists and linguists, yes. Anthropologists and linguists, Claude Lévi-Strauss being one of the most popular, started to look at cultures as distinct structures built on values and myths and words and meanings. So to create this map of them, or to understand this culture, to get a good picture of it, you needed to understand all the rules of the culture. And so structuralists looked for patterns in society, in the societies that they were studying, and more or less mapped it out. Okay, so to get this answer of what does text mean, I'm going to look at one of these big clues that they used to study a culture, and that was binary oppositions. And what that means is that to the structuralists, what they felt is that if you looked at a culture and figured out what it saw as opposites and how those opposites related to one another, then you could know more about the culture. So every culture, they assumed, has these binary oppositions: good, bad, up, down, male, female, order, chaos, Republican, Democrat. Anyway, and so you might think of it like this. To map out a culture, structuralists would make this like metaphorical line, okay? And on one pole is one part of that binary, good. It's the good stuff, it's the positive stuff. On the other pole is the opposite, bad or negative, right? And then they could put a multitude of words on that line. Well, here's where great is, well, magnificent. Terrible is way over here, it's bad. But then you also have concepts like dirty. Like in some cultures, dirty might mean bad. You know, it doesn't mean bad, but in some cultures they could see it as bad. One really good example for the Bible is in the Old Testament, and it is purity, right? If you're pure or common, pure, profane, or pure, impure. Impure doesn't necessarily mean bad. Okay, but in our culture, it really starts to mean bad. And so now we have a problem reading and understanding the text because we use those words differently. Okay, so all these words are part of this bigger structure. And what the structuralists are doing is they're looking at how all these words derive their meaning from one another. And in fact, they really derive their meaning from the entire society that uses them. So that's one of the ways we can map it out. And so what they would say is, you can understand a text not by going and asking the author what the text means, but you can understand a text by looking at the whole culture. The structuralists would say that to find the meaning of the text, you don't have to look for what the author believed or what the author wanted to say, but what the society thought as a whole. In fact, structuralists would say that the author is really just drawing from all of that vocabulary, from all that grammar, from all those symbols and myths of their culture. And so the whole system is really just kind of speaking through the author. So the author doesn't really create meaning, they just channeled that meaning into a text or a work of art, you might say. All right. When talking about the Bible, it might help to realize that structuralism came around the same time as this other outgrowth of modernism, and that is the historical critical method. You might know what that is. That was this time around the 1900s, early 1900s, when late 1800s, early 1900s, when biblical scholars really started to dissect the Bible and look for the history behind it. What was happening at the time? What did the people at the time believe? When were each of these books written? Where were they written? And that's still the primary method of studying the Bible in seminaries today. Like if you go to seminary for a degree in Bible, you're really going for a degree in ancient history with an emphasis in Bible. And so you can see how that's exactly what structuralism is, right? Understand the culture in order to understand the book. So if you're wanting to know what a certain parable of Jesus has meant, a certain parable of Jesus meant, you don't have to ask Jesus. You can instead study the culture and know what was going on at the time. And of course, Jesus says those things that the culture would have him say. He's reacting to, or he could even be reacting to his culture. But anyway, you have to understand the culture in order to understand what's being said. But if you ever taken a biblical studies class, you realize this is a huge process. The Bible has a long history behind it. Much of it was written in one culture, Greek, and they talked about things that happened in another culture, Hebrew. It was also written in different times, and certain books and stories were developed and redacted before they were even written. And this is why the historical critical method of studying the Bible has birthed all of these other types of criticisms, like form criticism and redaction criticism and textual criticism and source criticism, and on and on and on. But remember, the underlying thought here is there is a definite fixed meaning. We just have to work hard enough to find it. So to summarize, if you want to find out the meaning of what a text means, well, for authorial intent or intentionalism, ask the author. Analyze all of his or her works. Dig through their garbage. Find out who they really are. And then you can find out what the work means. For structuralists, to understand or to find out what a text means, you need to understand the culture of the author and how they put together all the symbols and the myths of the culture into this work. The biggest problem with the structuralist approach is going to be found out introduced by the post-structuralists. So, post-structuralism, what's that all about? And how did they say that you would find meaning in a text? All right. So in the 20th century, the post-structuralists come about. And I'm going to try to explain this in three different ways. I'm going to start with something that's little bit more involved and abstract, and I'm going to get easier and easier until I end up with a pretty simple definition of what post-structuralism is. So the first is the post-structuralists were students of the structuralists. So they learned all of these ways to study a culture. They learned all these methods from their teacher. And then, and this is one common way that it's said, they turned their methods on structuralism itself. And then what that means is that they came along and they said, okay, you want to make a map of a culture. Well, let's make a map of you. For instance, you're going to make a line and put on these binary oppositions like good and bad. Well, let's evaluate structuralism's binary oppositions to find out what they value. And the first thing we notice is that structuralism values having a line. Like, right, they make this line. I mean, they don't make an actual line. It's metaphorical, but roll with it. They make this line, and they're going to put all this meaning or all these words on it. Well, that means that they assume that the culture they're studying has binary oppositions, and also that they have an orderly way of talking with using them. So in evaluating other cultures, structuralism has already, simply by drawing a line, showed that their binary preference is for order, right? So by placing them at a solid place on the line, their value is already in stability. And so we have to ask, well, did the culture that you're studying have those same preferences? Like maybe they didn't care for linear thinking. Maybe they found meaning in their concepts being unstable, right? So what I'm saying is that the structuralists, the post-structuralists would say that structuralists are putting their values onto a different culture. So they're saying the process is inherently flawed because it already imposes its culture on another culture. And this is always going to happen. Like there's no way, the post-structuralists are saying it, from separating yourself from your culture. There's no systematic way to get at the meaning of another culture or what another culture is, the system of the other culture. Okay, so if you didn't follow that completely, here's a second, more understandable way, I think, an easier way to explain the relationship between the two. You can think of structuralism developed all these rules that they're going to use to look at these cultures and map them out. And post-structuralism just used the rules a lot closer, like they looked a lot closer at things. And so they said things like, well, you have good over here, but good doesn't always mean good. The meanings of words change. And since all words are defined in relationship to those other words, then that means that meaning in the whole language is constantly shifting. And not only is is the meaning of the whole language constantly changing, but each individual person is going to have a history, a past. They're going to bring all of that to the things that they say, the things they write down. And that's always changing too, and it's always different for everybody. Not only is it different for them, but it's different for you too. And so there's no good way to get at, for one culture to study another. And if you don't remember anything I just said about those first two explanations, the third explanation, the most basic, and basically it's saying, whereas structuralism said that there are fixed meanings of words and concepts, post-structuralism is saying meaning is always shifting. You can't build a structure of a society because our words and concepts are always changing, and so are their words and concepts. A very clear example of this from the Bible is the word logos, or the very first part of John. In the beginning of John's gospel, in the beginning was the logos, or the word. The logos was with God, and the logos was God. Logos is one of those words that has a very long history in Greek culture. And so can you really use an ancient philosopher's definition of logos that they were using 500 years before Jesus to say what the author of the Gospel of John means by this phrase, and he's writing maybe 80 to 100 years after Jesus? The weird answer is, maybe you can. If you're going off of authorial intent, maybe the author really thought, hey, I really stick to Heraclitus and what he said about logos. But we just don't know. We have no way of knowing that. Like, we have such a wide span of this word, we have no idea where the author of the Gospel of John got the word, how the author of the Gospel of John used the word throughout his life, maybe, and then certainly what he meant by using that word in that gospel. Now, throw in 2,000 years plus of Christian dogma, right, and like ideas of Trinity and what logos means. Is there any way that we here in the 21st century could even come close to figuring out what logos meant at the time it was written by a certain author? Okay, so it seems pretty bleak for post-structuralism. Like, how do you find out what a text means? How do you know what it means to call Jesus the Logos, or simply like if my analysis of the stand is correct? Well, that's where we're going to get into the death of the author. The post-structuralist movement is commonly thought to have started in 1967 when Roland Barthes published an article called The Death of the Author. Now, Barthes didn't actually come up with the idea on his own, and he was the first to suggest it, but he was by far the most popular. And like I said, this is when most people would see the shift from structuralism to post-structuralism. What Barthes suggests was that once the text is written, the author's intention no longer determines its meaning. Instead, meaning is created by readers as they interact with the text. And they bring their own experiences to that text. They bring their own culture, their own understanding of it, their own myths to that text. Barthes says once the work is completed, the author dies, and now we have the birth of the reader. So the meaning of the text might be, and really is, different for every person. And since our experiences, our culture, our imaginations, and of course the words we use to describe all of that, since all of those things are constantly changing, the meaning of a text is always changing also. So an easy way to think of it is, intentionalism would say the author gives meaning to a text. Structuralism would say a culture gives meaning to the text. And post-structuralists would say the reader gives meaning to a text. Or better, the reader brings their meaning to that text. So Barthes' article was published, and this concept of the death of the author has evolved as philosophers and literary critics have pondered the consequences of this. One important outgrowth, I think, in post-structuralist movement is, and this concept of death of the author, is that these post-structuralists, like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, the two of the biggest names that I'm aware of, began to see how this shifting culture shifts because of power struggles. So there's always power struggles inside of a culture. For instance, We might think of race or class struggles. As Bart said, all these people bring their own experiences and cultures to the text. Well, one culture is going to be more powerful than the other, and so is that their interpretation is going to be usually generally accepted as the correct interpretation. And of course, we can see how this is done in the Bible, right? Like Jesus has a lot to say about how terrible it is, or how hard it is for a rich person to get into the kingdom of heaven. But rich people don't like that very much. And so they interpret it to mean that Jesus is really talking about spiritual wealth. And they're the more powerful ones, their interpretations rule. Jesus says, blessed are the poor and the meek and the hungry and the outcast. But especially in my culture today, well, white people don't really like that very much because it assumes that the minority is favored, not the majority. So we tend to interpret that to mean something else. All right, so we've established that a text does not have an inherent meaning, either given to it by the author or the culture, because the culture is always shifting and unstable, which, by the way, even if it did have an inherent meaning given to it, we wouldn't be able to figure it out because we have a culture that meaning is always shifting. So anyway, because of that, we've determined, the post-structuralists have said, the reader is the one who brings meaning to a text by interpreting it. So the question to ask is, how, according to the post-structuralists, would we know if we have a good interpretation of the text? Well, first, a good interpretation is one that is consistent with the text, and that makes sense, or at least tries to be consistent with the text. Second, it's one that recognizes its own biases, and especially biases of power. So, for instance, here is what I see in the text as a European white Christian male, right? So that shows that I recognize my biases. And so by doing that, a good interpretation also recognizes that all interpretations come from some sort of power dynamic, and it just recognizes that. It recognizes that in the interpretation, and so of course a good interpretation also recognizes that it's not the only interpretation, and that others with other cultural biases will interpret that text differently. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't necessarily mean mine is right and yours is wrong. In fact, saying that is saying is a power struggle, saying I have my interpretation from this point of view and you have your interpretation from that point of view. So basically, post-structuralists would say meaning always comes from a vantage point. And the best that we can do is to recognize our own vantage point when trying to ascribe meaning to a text. As a conclusion, I want to look at this well-known meme. So here's a good, for instance, and we can use this as an example. You may have seen this meme show up. Here's these two guys, and they're looking at this number on the ground. The number is a text. It's a symbol meant to convey some sort of meaning, and depending on how these two people look at it, the meaning is different. Like one of them looks at it and says, this is a 6. One of them looks at it and says, this is a 9. And it seems to me, from my vantage point, that this meme was created to say that we don't have to be jerks to one another, to other people who disagree with us. We just need to realize that they're looking at things from a different viewpoint. Now, some person had a very hard time with this. They wanted to insist that really, it does have an answer. And so they applied, they said they appealed to intentionalism. What did the author think? That'll solve this whole problem. And so they said, well, one of these people is really correct because the author meant something, right? And by the way, the post-structuralists would point out that by doing that, they're really trying to exert their power over the other people to say, no, I'm smarter than you are. I have the answer right here. And it was probably for that reason of exerting the power that someone decided to, as they say, fix the meme, so that now one person is right and the other person's view is wrong. The problem with that, however, is that, well, first, what if the author messed up and they meant to paint a 6 but got confused and accidentally painted a 9? Do we call this a 6 or a 9? Here's another problem. Let's say this number is the only thing remaining of a parking lot for a store that used to be in the West. It was originally written to be a number 6, and it marked the sixth parking spot. However, many years passed, that store was demolished, and so another store was put on the west. Did I say west earlier? I don't. Anyway, the opposite side. And it just so happens that, hey, now this marks the 9th parking spot. So the author intended for it to be a 6, but now it's being used as a 9. Well, which one is it? Likewise, to a structuralist, they would appeal to that also, and they'd say, well, we know what that symbol means because we look at the original culture. If the original store was there, then that number is originally meant to be a 6. And that makes sense. But the post-structuralist would answer and say, first, how do you know that they counted like us? First, you have to establish that they had the same order of numbers like us, and they used the same symbols for those numbers. Also, isn't it weird that if there were a parking lot with numbers, the only one that survived is this 6 or 9? We can't tell which one. Maybe the person who kept it there kept it there for this very reason. And so maybe there now is a second author, right? That composed this. Not just the person who wrote it down, but the person who demolished the parking lot. Maybe they're an author, and they want to preserve this one number to teach this lesson. Also, from our culture, 69 has a pretty specific meaning, right? And so maybe this guy was just trying to make a joke. Like if you walked around it, you had to say 69 to yourself. Or maybe this culture that you're looking at really had another specific meaning of 6 or 9 or even 96. And so they imagine that you'd walk around the other way and say 96. Ultimately, what post-structuralists would say is, hey, we don't know. We have no idea if that's a 6 or a 9. So they would say, instead of looking for the definite meaning or trying to uncover the historical meaning of what the text used to mean, right, or what the author meant for it to be, or what it meant throughout history, instead of trying to do all that stuff and trying to exert our authority over one another, what we need to do is just realize that the text can have a multitude of meanings and use that knowledge to help us relate to and try to understand each other. All right. That was my video on, that's my take on death of the author, and especially how we find meaning from a text. It felt like it was kind of long, so maybe it is. I don't know. I'll have to go back and relook at it. If you liked it, I would urge you to subscribe to my channel. I do have an awful lot of ideas that I think you should know about on there. And if you're a Stephen King fan, then I would also definitely say you need to subscribe. All right. Have a great day.